Prime Minister Mark Carney has talked about in the past how he and Canada can play a bit of a bigger role on that stage, and this is a perfect example of that.
Canada is set to be home to a new multinational bank for defense projects by NATO members and allies.
Canada is about to host a $130 billion NATO defense bank, and this isn't just about financing, it's about control. Because in modern warfare, the country that controls the money doesn't just support strategy, it shapes it. And right now, NATO allies are quietly handing that leverage to Canada, not the United States. That shift sets the stage for a deeper change in how power inside the alliance actually works. In April 2026, NATO members and partner countries agreed to establish a new Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank, with Canada selected as the host nation. The goal is straightforward: provide long-term, low-cost financing for defense projects across the alliance, including weapons procurement, infrastructure, and supply chain expansion. The scale tells the real story. This institution is expected to mobilize more than $130 billion in capital, backed by a mix of governments and major global financial institutions. In practical terms, it creates a centralized funding engine for NATO's next generation of military investment. This decision also arrives at a politically sensitive moment. The United States under President Donald Trump continues to pressure allies on defense spending, while signaling a more transactional approach to NATO commitments. That combination has introduced uncertainty into long-term planning across the alliance. Instead of waiting for that uncertainty to resolve, allies moved ahead. They built a system that could operate through it, and they placed it in Canada. That choice is what turns this from a technical development into a strategic one.
It is a signal that NATO members are putting their trust in Canada and believe Canada can play a key role in the future of the membership and a future of the group at a time when we've seen, President Trump at times express, a lack of interest in NATO as it stands.
To understand the real impact, you have to start with a simple principle. Whoever controls capital controls capability. Modern defense systems don't just rely on engineering or manpower. They depend on stable financial pipelines that support multi-decade procurement cycles, industrial expansion, and infrastructure development. These are not short-term decisions. They are commitments that shape military capacity for decades. By hosting this bank, Canada steps into the point where those financial flows come together. It becomes the place where projects are supported, sustained, and scaled. That doesn't mean Canada dictates every outcome, but it does mean it sits much closer to the center of how those outcomes are determined. And in strategic terms, proximity to the flow of capital is proximity to influence. That position naturally translates into a deeper role in shaping NATO's future capabilities. When financing is centralized, visibility follows. Canada gains insight into which defense programs are expanding, which technologies are being prioritized, and where the alliance is directing its long-term resources. Over time, that insight allows Canada to align its own industrial and strategic planning with those priorities. This creates a reinforcing cycle. Canadian firms, infrastructure, and partnerships can integrate more directly into NATO's defense ecosystem, attracting investment and scaling alongside alliance priorities. The financial role strengthens industrial positioning, and industrial positioning strengthens political relevance. The result is not just participation, but integration at a much higher level, one that can influence tens of billions of dollars in defense-related activity over the coming years. As this system develops, it inevitably affects how power is distributed within NATO. For decades, the United States has been the central hub across military, financial, and political dimensions. That role is not disappearing, but it is evolving. By establishing a major financial institution outside the United States, NATO is introducing a new layer into its structure, one that does not rely entirely on Washington. This shift is less about weakening the United States and more about strengthening the alliance as a whole. By spreading key functions across multiple countries, NATO becomes more resilient to political changes in any single capital. At the same time, this reduces the degree to which all decisions flow through the United States. Power is no longer concentrated in one place. It is distributed across a broader network, and Canada is now a central node in that network. That redistribution has been shaped, in part, by the current political environment in Washington. The Trump administration has applied sustained pressure on NATO allies, pushing for higher defense spending while signaling that U.S. commitments may not always be unconditional. In the short term, this has driven increased investment across the alliance. But over the longer term, it has introduced uncertainty into a system that depends on consistency. Defense planning cannot operate on shifting signals. It requires stable expectations over decades. Faced with that uncertainty, allies have adapted. They have not rejected U.S. leadership, but they have begun to build structures that reduce reliance on it. The Canada Bank is one of those structures. It allows NATO to continue expanding its capabilities without tying every financial decision to the political climate in Washington. This is not confrontation, it is strategic preparation. What makes this development particularly effective for Canada is how it has been executed. There has been no dramatic shift in tone, no attempt to openly challenge the United States. Instead, Canada has built credibility through consistency. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, it has expanded defense commitments, strengthened ties with European partners, and positioned itself as a reliable anchor within the alliance. Hosting the bank builds directly on that foundation. It deepens Canada's role without provoking conflict, allowing influence to grow through structure rather than rhetoric. At the same time, this move supports Canada's broader economic strategy. Defense financing at this scale connects directly to industries like advanced manufacturing, energy, and critical minerals, all areas where Canada holds strategic advantages. It creates opportunities for investment, job growth, and long-term industrial development. This is where geopolitics and economics converge. The more central Canada becomes in financing defense, the more central it becomes in producing and supporting it. Seen in isolation, the Canada Bank is significant, but placed in context, it becomes part of a larger trajectory. Canada is strengthening its partnerships with Europe, expanding its defense footprint, and investing in infrastructure and strategic sectors. At the same time, it is reducing its reliance on the United States while remaining fully engaged within the alliance. That balance is intentional. Canada is not stepping away from its closest ally, but it is ensuring that its position is not defined by dependency. Instead, it is building a more flexible and resilient role within a changing global system. And that is what makes this moment different. It is not just a reaction to current events, but a reflection of a longer-term strategy. The Canada Bank is more than a financing tool. It is a structural shift in how NATO organizes power. By hosting this institution, Canada gains a level of influence that extends beyond its size. It becomes part of the mechanism that determines how defense capabilities are funded, scaled, and sustained. For the United States, this does not signal an immediate loss of leadership, but it does mark a change in how that leadership is shared. Influence is no longer concentrated in one place. It is distributed across a network that is becoming more complex and more resilient. And that leads to a simple but important question. If Canada now helps control the financial backbone of NATO, how long before it starts shaping the direction of the alliance itself?
Canada is now considering putting troops on the ground in Greenland, and the ripple effect is already disturbing the White House. What began as Donald Trump's latest tariff threat has escalated into a direct test of strength in the Arctic, and Ottawa is signaling that the future of the North will not be shaped by unilateral demands out of Washington.
What are you going to do about it, including adding to the military presence in Greenland?
It's a serious situation, and we're concerned. We're concerned about this escalation. I had conversations with the NATO Secretary General in Paris 10 days ago, within the past 2 weeks at least, about how we're going to further enhance that security umbrella. It's something that Canada is working on already and contributing to when I say working on within the broader Arctic.
For weeks, tensions over Greenland have intensified. U.S. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, has revived his ambition to bring Greenland under American influence. He argues that the U.S. must secure the Arctic totally to counter rising global competition.
And in private messages to European leaders, he has even tied this ambition to frustrations about not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Publicly, he threatened to impose a 10% tariff, rising to 25% by June, on 8 European allies unless they agree to negotiate the transfer of Greenland. Europe dismissed the ultimatum. Denmark warned it would not be blackmailed. Other European leaders echoed that rejection, insisting that Greenlandic self-determination and territorial integrity are not bargaining chips. And now, Canada has entered the picture in a way that changes the entire strategic equation. Ottawa is considering deploying a limited number of Canadian soldiers to Greenland as part of a NATO Arctic training mission alongside European partners. Officially, this exercise focuses on Arctic readiness and deterring foreign military activity in the region. But privately, senior officials acknowledge the timing is deliberate. Canada is sending a signal that no country, including the United States, has the right to reshape territorial realities in the north. The deployment would be modest, likely fewer than a dozen soldiers. Yet symbolism often outweighs scale, and that symbolism lands directly in the middle of Trump's strategy, because he has already warned that any ally sending troops to Greenland may face tariffs. That warning now applies to Canada.
Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has embraced a sharper Arctic doctrine centered on sovereignty, rule of law, and collective security. Recent public briefings and government statements make clear that Ottawa sees Arctic stability as a shared responsibility, not a project dominated by any one country. This directly contradicts Trump's argument that American control is the only credible foundation for Arctic security. For Canada, Greenland is not a remote curiosity. It sits between two critical pillars of Canadian defense, NORAD to the south and the Canadian Arctic Archipelago to the west. Any attempt by a foreign power, even an ally, to absorb Greenland would redraw the Arctic security map and weaken Canada's strategic depth. That is something Carney cannot allow, especially after months of U.S. tariff pressure and the ongoing reshoring push that has pulled major auto investments out of Ontario. With the 2026 USMCA review approaching, Ottawa has no intention of letting Washington dictate the boundaries of North American security. Greenland has now become part of a larger pattern, Canada refusing to accept that the United States alone sets the rules of engagement in the North.
Trump expected resistance from Europe. What he did not anticipate was Canada stepping directly into the fray. That decision undermines his Greenland strategy on several levels and complicates the narrative he has tried to build. First, it disrupts his vision of a united Western Hemisphere front. Trump has said repeatedly that North America must act as one bloc to confront rising global powers. But Canada's alignment with Europe on such a fundamental security question weakens the idea that Washington controls the Arctic agenda. Suddenly, North America is no longer marching in step. Second, Canada's involvement transforms the issue into a broader alliance matter. A dispute between Washington and Europe is one thing. A dispute involving Washington, Europe, and Canada creates the appearance of a coalition rejecting Trump's approach. When Canada steps in, the crisis no longer feels like Trump versus Denmark. It feels like Trump versus the entire Arctic security network. Third, it forces Trump into a strategic corner. If he retaliates economically against Canada for participating in a multilateral Arctic mission, he will be punishing a country that forms half of NORAD. In other words, he would be targeting the infrastructure that protects the U.S. homeland. Ottawa is fully aware of this contradiction. Trump cannot punish Canada without weakening the very defense framework he argues must be strengthened.
Canada already committing $6 billion to an over-the-horizon radar system for the far north.
We have to do more in our Arctic, but we also have to be kind of calm. More important thing is to work with our Arctic allies.
Canada's posture in the north has become noticeably more assertive. A multi-billion-dollar modernization of NORAD is underway. New radar systems are being developed, and air and sea patrol capability is expanding. Cooperation with Nordic states has also deepened as Arctic tensions have risen. Carney's doctrine is straightforward. Canada will not accept any attempt by any country to undermine Arctic sovereignty or destabilize existing territorial arrangements. Deploying troops to Greenland is the clearest physical expression of that doctrine so far.
Public remarks from Danish and Greenlandic leaders make clear they welcome Allied involvement that reinforces defense and deterrence, but reject any form of coercion. Greenlandic officials have stated consistently that their right to self-determination is absolute.
Danish authorities have also expressed appreciation for Canada's measured, rules-based approach at a moment when the political climate around Greenland has turned volatile. For Denmark, Canada is the ideal partner, an Arctic neighbor with no territorial ambitions and a strong commitment to shared security.
If Trump decides to impose tariffs on Canada over a deployment that is coordinated with allies, the consequences could be significant. It would mean the United States is sanctioning a defense partner in the middle of a shared security mission. That would introduce political strain into NORAD at a moment when threats in the region are increasing. It could also accelerate Canada's shift toward economic diversification in Europe and Asia, a shift already underway after repeated tariff confrontations over the past year. The Greenland dispute would no longer be a distant diplomatic quarrel. It would become a direct blow to the Canada-US relationship months before the USMCA review. And for Canada, the stakes are personal. If the United States unilaterally dictates Greenland's future today, the fear is that nothing prevents it from attempting to dictate the future of Canada's Arctic tomorrow. That logic explains why Ottawa is preparing to act rather than wait.
Canada's potential troop deployment to Greenland is not defined by its scale, it is defined by its message. It tells Europe that Canada is prepared to stand with its allies. It tells Denmark and Greenland that sovereignty is not something to be negotiated under pressure. And it tells Washington that the Arctic will not be shaped by unilateral demands. Trump envisioned a straightforward path: exert pressure, gain leverage, and secure Greenland. Instead, Canada's move risks turning his Arctic strategy into a geopolitical dead end. The only remaining question is whether Trump escalates further, or whether Ottawa and its allies have just forced him to reconsider the cost of pushing too far in the north. What is clear is that the Arctic is no longer quiet, and Canada is no longer watching from the sidelines.